The weekend that wasn't hers, it was one of those early Friday mornings where the air felt crisp enough to wake your soul, and the gentle mist over the lake seemed like a scene straight out of a painting. My cabin sat at the edge of the water, tucked away in the kind of quiet that people in the city pay thousands of dollars to escape to for a weekend. For me, it wasn't just a retreat, it was my sanctuary, a place I had built with my own hands and hard-earned money after years of working through sleepless nights and endless responsibilities. Every nail in the walls, every polished plank in the wooden deck, every carefully chosen rock along the pathway leading to the dock carried a piece of my story. This was the one place I allowed myself to breathe without the noise of the world telling me what to do. And so, when the crisp morning air was interrupted by the loud, commanding sound of someone pounding on my cabin door, my first thought was that maybe a neighbor needed help. After all, we were far from town, and emergencies out here meant you looked after each other. I opened the door, expecting perhaps an anxious fisherman or a lost hiker, but instead, standing there was Karen, our HOA president. Now I've dealt with Karen before. She was one of those people who believed every square inch of the neighborhood was under her personal jurisdiction, whether the HOA owned it or not. She wore that look, the one she always had when she was about to drop a demand wrapped in faux politeness, and before I could even say, "Good morning," she marched past me into my cabin as if the property line had suddenly dissolved into thin air. She had that perfume cloud following her, the type that wasn't unpleasant, but was so strong it claimed the air in any room it entered. Without asking, she plopped herself into the armchair by my fireplace and began speaking in that clipped, no-nonsense tone that was her trademark. "Here's the deal," she began, waving one manicured hand as if she was about to announce a neighborhood evacuation. "I'm going to be using this cabin this weekend. I have guests flying in from out of state, and frankly, the HOA's clubhouse is under renovation, so this is the only suitable location for entertaining them. It's just for 2 nights. I'll bring it back exactly as I found it," she said, it as though she was borrowing a cup of sugar, not my personal home and the heart of my peace. My first reaction was to laugh, thinking surely this was some kind of strange joke or misunderstanding. But the way her eyes locked on mine, unblinking and expectant, told me she was dead serious. I took a slow breath, reminding myself that losing my cool with Karine was like adding gasoline to a fire. It would only end with smoke choking both of us. "Karen," I began, my voice calm but firm, "this cabin is my private property. I don't rent it out, and I certainly don't hand it over for events. I'm sorry your clubhouse isn't available, but my home is not up for grabs." The moment the words left my mouth, I could see her posture stiffen, her smile thin into that tight, condescending smirk she used whenever someone dared to stand in the way of her grand plans. She leaned forward in the chair, narrowing her eyes, as if trying to figure out whether my refusal was an opening offer in a negotiation or just a lapse in my understanding of how things worked under her rule. "Well," she finally said, her voice dripping with that brand of entitlement only years of unchecked behavior can cultivate, "you do realize that the HOA has authority over properties in the community when it comes to communal benefit, right? And having my guests here will benefit everyone networking, social visibility, potential investors looking into our neighborhood." She was spiraling into some fantasy pitch about how her social weekend would somehow increase property values for everyone. But her mistake was assuming I was someone who could be intimidated by jargon and self-importance. I'd spent too many years dealing with boardroom egos and corporate bullies to fall for that game. "Karen," I interrupted this time, not bothering to hide the edge in my voice, "this isn't an HOA matter. This cabin isn't even part of the HOA jurisdiction. I bought it years before the HOA expanded, and your paperwork doesn't cover a single inch of my land. You might be used to telling people what to do, but that doesn't work here." Her smirk faltered for the briefest moment, but she recovered quickly, tilting her head and giving me that sly look that always meant she was about to escalate. She stood up, smoothed the front of her tailored blazer, and in a voice meant to sound calm but loaded with threat, said, "I'll give you a chance to reconsider. It would be unfortunate if the association had to take further steps." And with that, she walked out, heels clicking against the wooden floor, leaving the scent of her perfume and the tension lingering in the room. I thought that would be the end of it. After all, I had been clear, and surely even Karen had limits. But the thing about people like her is that they take a no as a challenge, not a conclusion. By mid-afternoon, while I was out on the dock repairing one of the railings, I noticed her silver SUV parked right outside my property gate, and she was on her phone, pacing like a general giving battlefield orders. I didn't think much of it. Until, about 30 minutes later, I heard sirens in the distance. Out here, sirens are rare, and they make you pause because you know it's either something serious or something unnecessary but loud. As the sound grew closer, I saw the unmistakable flash of red and blue lights weaving through the trees. My stomach sank, not out of guilt, but because I knew exactly who had made the call. When the two police officers stepped out of the cruiser, I could see them exchange quick glances at Karen, who was standing there with crossed arms and an expression of exaggerated relief, as if she had just been rescued from imminent danger. She wasted no time marching up to them and launching into a loud, animated retelling of her plight, how I was illegally occupying a property that belonged to the community, how I had threatened her when she asked to use it, and how she feared for her safety. Her performance would have made a soap opera star proud, complete with hand gestures, shaky breaths, and side glances at me to make sure I knew she was in control of the narrative. The officers approached me, their expressions professional, but clearly already sensing there was more to the story. "Sir," one of them began, "we received a call about a property dispute. Can we talk inside?" I nodded, leading them in, already pulling out the thick folder that held every deed, tax receipt, and legal document related to my cabin. As they flipped through the paperwork, I explained calmly that the property had never been under HOA authority, and that Karen had shown up uninvited demanding to use it for her personal event. I could see the moment the reality clicked for them. The legal descriptions matched. My ownership was indisputable, and Karen's claim had no leg to stand on. When they stepped back outside to speak with her, I stayed by the doorway, watching from a distance. Her voice, once confident and commanding, grew sharper and more desperate as the officers explained the situation. She kept gesturing wildly toward my cabin, her words tumbling over each other, but it was clear the officers weren't buying it. Finally, one of them held up a hand, said something that made her throw her arms up in frustration, and then watched as she stomped back to her SUV, slamming the door hard enough to echo off the trees. She didn't leave quietly, though she rolled down her window, glared at me, and shouted, "This isn't over," before tearing off down the gravel road. Standing there on my porch, watching the dust from her tires settle in the air, I realized something important. This was not just about my cabin. This was about people like Karen who believe that control and entitlement are their birthrights, who think kindness is weakness and boundaries are invitations to push harder. But here's the thing, I'd spent too long building my life, my peace, and my sanctuary to let anyone, HOA title or not, take it from me. And if this was just the opening move in her little game, she had no idea that I was ready for the long fight. The HOA's quiet war becomes loud the weekend, passed with a strange, heavy quietness in the air, the kind you feel before a storm. It wasn't the kind of silence that meant peace. It was the kind that whispered of movement behind the scenes, of conversations happening in rooms you weren't invited to, of someone plotting while smiling to your face. I spent most of Saturday morning out on the lake, fishing in the early sunlight, letting the steady rhythm of the water calm my thoughts. But even as I cast my line, I couldn't shake the image of Karen's narrowed eyes and the venom in her voice when she'd shouted, "This isn't over." People like her didn't know how to let things go. They didn't walk away from a loss, they rebranded it as a delay date by Monday morning. I had my first sign that she was up to something. I found a neatly folded letter stuffed into my mailbox, not the regular HOA newsletter, but a special notice of community meeting, printed on thick paper with the HOA logo stamped at the top like it was an official government order. The meeting was scheduled for Thursday evening in the community hall, with the subject listed as Discussion of Community Property Use Guidelines. The title alone was enough to make my gut tighten. Karen wasn't coming at me directly anymore. She was aiming to change the rules entirely, twisting definitions and exploiting every gray area to try to fold my cabin into her jurisdiction. And if I knew anything about HOA politics, it was that rules weren't just written. They were spun, sugar-coated, and sold to the unsuspecting as beneficial for all. I decided then that I wasn't going to walk into that meeting unprepared. The next few days became a crash course in local property law, HOA regulations, and community history. I pulled every record I could find, old maps, original development agreements, annexation documents, and I found exactly what I'd suspected. My cabin's land was explicitly excluded from the HOA's authority when the community was formed. The legal language was clear as daylight. The cabin, the dock, and the entire stretch of shoreline it sat on were private property with zero obligations to the HOA. Still, knowing Karen, facts weren't going to be her strongest weapon. She would rely on pressure, manipulation, and rallying enough voices to make dissent feel like rebellion. Thursday evening came faster than I expected. The community hall was buzzing with people when I arrived, the low hum of conversations blending with the smell of coffee and those little supermarket cookies that seemed to show up at every meeting. I noticed how Karen was already working the room like a seasoned politician, touching shoulders, leaning in to whisper, nodding sympathetically at whatever grievances people had. It was a performance, and she was good at it, good enough that half the room would probably believe whatever story she spun next. I took a seat toward the back, legal folder in hand, and waited. When the meeting began, Karen wasted no time taking control. As a HOA president, she stood at the front, flanked by two board members who looked like they had been chosen more for their loyalty than their critical thinking skills. She cleared her throat and launched into her speech, her voice dripping with faux warmth. "Friends, neighbors," she began, "our community is built on shared values, cooperation, mutual respect, and the understanding that we all contribute to the beauty and reputation of our neighborhood. But lately, we've faced challenges that threaten that harmony. Specifically, issues with certain properties not being used in a way that benefits the community as a whole." Her words were vague enough to seem harmless to anyone who didn't know the backstory, but I could feel every eye in the room subtly shift toward me. She went on, carefully weaving the narrative to make it sound like my cabin, my sanctuary, was some kind of neglected resource that I was selfishly hoarding. "Imagine," she continued, "if our beautiful lakeside properties could be available for special community events, for guests who bring opportunities, for gatherings that strengthen our bonds. It's a shame when certain individuals refuse to cooperate for the greater good." Her tone never once broke into outright accusation, but the implication was as sharp as a knife. I let her finish, even as my pulse quickened. When the floor was open for comments, I stood, feeling dozens of eyes follow me as I walked to the front. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. "Neighbors," I began, "I've heard a lot tonight about cooperation, about the greater good. But what I haven't heard is the truth. My cabin is private property, purchased before this HOA even existed, and explicitly excluded from its jurisdiction. I am not obligated legally or otherwise to hand it over for anyone's use. And while I respect the desire for community events, Using someone's home without their consent isn't cooperation, it's trespassing. I pulled out the maps and agreements, laying them on the table so the room could see. I pointed to the clauses, the signatures, the county seal that validated every page. Murmurs spread through the crowd as people leaned forward to read. Some looked surprised. Others looked uncomfortable, realizing that they'd been fed a curated version of the story. Karen's face stayed still, but her eyes flashed with frustration. "This isn't about legality," she said quickly, stepping forward as if to reclaim the narrative. "It's about community spirit." I met her gaze without blinking. Spirit doesn't override the law, Karen, and it certainly doesn't override respect for personal boundaries. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut. Some of the board members shifted uncomfortably, and a few voices from the back muttered in agreement with me. But I could see Karen's mind working, even as she smiled tightly and announced that the matter would be tabled for further discussion. That was her way of saying she'd lost this round, but wasn't conceding the war dot as people filed out. A few neighbors stopped to quietly tell me they supported me, that they didn't agree with forcing someone to give up their property. It was a small comfort, knowing I wasn't entirely alone in this. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that Karine wasn't done, that she was already plotting her next move, one that might not come through official channels but could still make my life at the cabin difficult. When I got home that night, the lake was still, the reflection of the moon stretching across the water like silver silk. I stood on the porch for a long time, breathing in the cool night air, reminding myself why I was here in the first place. This cabin wasn't just wood and nails, it was years of sacrifice, a lifetime of memories, and the last piece of my life, where I didn't have to answer to anyone's demands. If Karen thought she could chip away at that, she was about to learn that I was built for more than quiet fishing mornings. I was built to stand my ground, no matter how loud the fight got. The harassment begins. It didn't take long for Karen to change her tactics. After the public blow she took at the meeting, I knew she wouldn't come at me with another friendly request. That wasn't her style when she felt cornered. People like Karen don't retreat, they adapt, they find smaller cracks to slip through. They start with annoyances that seem insignificant at first, but grow like weeds if you ignore them. And sure enough, the first of these irritations arrived the very next week, hidden inside a plain white envelope marked HOA correspondence. I almost tossed it into the pile of junk mail, but something about the sharp, precise handwriting of my address made me open it. Inside was a formal notice of violation, stating that my property was in breach of HOA landscaping standards due to unsightly vegetation growth along the roadside. At first, I laughed out loud. My cabin wasn't under HOA jurisdiction, something Karen herself knew perfectly well, so the idea of them issuing me a fine was absurd. But the tone of the letter was designed to intimidate. Stern legal phrasing, vague threats about further action if the problem wasn't corrected, and a $250 administrative fee tacked on at the bottom. It was petty, transparent, and entirely without merit. Still, it was the first move in a game she was clearly willing to drag out. I tossed the letter into a folder I started labeling Karen files and decided to ignore it. But deep down I knew ignoring Karen was like ignoring a leak in your roof. It never just stops on its own. Over the next month, the letters multiplied. First it was lawn maintenance. Then it was improper exterior lighting because the warm amber bulbs I had on the porch didn't match the HOA's approved cool white scheme. Then it was a bizarre claim about unapproved structures because of the old fishing shed near the dock, which had been there decades before any HOA map existed. Each notice came with a fine, escalating from $250 to $500 to $1,000, as if sheer repetition and inflated numbers would scare me into paying. I responded to none of them, instead carefully stacking them into the growing folder and noting the dates, just in case this ever escalated into a legal arena, where proof mattered more than gossip. But Karen wasn't content with paper threats. I started noticing subtle changes whenever I left the property for even a few hours. Once, I came home from running errands to find that the sign on my front gate, an old wooden plaque with my family name carved into it, had been painted over with dull gray. Another time, I discovered my trash bins had been dragged down the Mayogayu road and overturned, scattering the contents like some careless raccoon had gone on a rampage. The strangest incident happened one rainy Tuesday when I found a small plastic bag of empty beer cans left neatly by my dock. At first, I thought maybe someone had been careless and left their garbage. But when I saw the placement right under my security camera, I realized exactly what it was. Planted evidence. It was almost laughable. The way she was trying to build a false narrative. If I'd been less cautious, those cans could have been photographed and circulated as proof that I was hosting rowdy gatherings, disturbing the peace, or whatever new HOA clause she was itching to enforce. Luckily for me, the security camera had captured the truth. A blurry but unmistakable figure in a raincoat with the same patterned scarf Karen had worn the night of the meeting. She had walked right up to the dock, placed the bag, and walked away without even attempting to hide her gait. I debated confronting her directly, but I decided against it. Direct confrontation only gave her another opportunity to twist the story into something ugly. Instead, I quietly made backup copies of the footage, storing them on multiple drives and even mailing one to a trusted friend in case anything mysterious happened to my property or to me. I started to see this for what it was, not just a feud over a cabin, but a war of patience and persistence. Karen was betting on me losing my temper, breaking some minor law, or simply giving up out of exhaustion. But I had dealt with worse storms in my life, storms that lasted years, not weeks, and I wasn't about to let her win by attrition. What really made me see how deep her obsession ran was a conversation I overheard one Saturday at the local grocery store. I was in the produce section, minding my own business, when I caught Corinne's voice drifting over from the next aisle. She was talking to another HOA board member, her words low but filled with venom. "If he won't give me the cabin, I'll make him wish he'd never bought it. He'll either hand it over or sell just to get me off his back. And when he does, I'll make sure it's the HOA that buys it." Her tone was so casual, so certain, it made my blood run cold, not out of fear, but out of the realization that she wasn't just being difficult. She had a plan. That night I sat at my kitchen table with the Karen files folder spread open in front of me, every notice and photograph laid out in a neat timeline. I thought about the kind of person who invests this much energy into controlling something that isn't theirs, the kind of entitlement it takes to not just ignore boundaries, but actively destroy them. And I decided something important. I wasn't just going to defend myself. I was going to gather every shred of evidence, every misstep, every abuse of authority, and use it to make sure she couldn't pull this stunt with anyone else in the future. So I installed more cameras, hidden this time, covering angles she wouldn't expect. I spoke quietly to neighbors I trusted, learning that I wasn't the only one she had targeted with bogus fines and harassment. I began to see the pattern, how she went after people who were too busy, too tired, or too uninformed to fight back, and how most of them either paid up or moved away just to get some peace. I wasn't going to be another name on that list. The next move, I knew, would be hers. And something told me she was about to push harder than ever before. What she didn't realize was that she had already given me everything I needed to turn the tide. The false emergency, it happened on a quiet Sunday afternoon, the kind of day where the lake glistened under a lazy sun, and the only sounds were the occasional call of a loon and the creak of the dock as the water shifted beneath it. I'd been sitting on the porch with a mug of coffee, a thick legal binder open on the table in front of me, when the faint wail of sirens reached my ears. Out here, that sound always travels far, bouncing between the hills, but I could tell by the growing volume that they were coming directly toward my property. My first thought was that maybe there'd been an accident nearby. Maybe someone had gotten hurt on the water. But as the sound grew closer, my gut told me something else. This wasn't coincidence. Karen had been quiet for a couple of weeks. Too quiet, and I'd learned that her silences weren't signs of surrender. They were moments of planning. Sure enough, the gravel at the end of my driveway erupted in a cloud of dust as two sheriff's vehicles pulled in, lights flashing. Behind them, almost like she'd rehearsed the timing, came Karen's silver SUV, gliding in like a self-appointed queen arriving to oversee her troops. The deputies stepped out first, scanning the property in quick, purposeful motions, one hand resting lightly near their holsters in the kind of stance that made it clear they thought they were responding to something urgent. Karen was out of her vehicle before the dust had even settled, striding toward them in a show of exaggerated concern. Pointing toward my cabin with sharp, jabbing gestures, I stood, setting my coffee aside, my mind already flipping through possibilities. If she'd called in some sort of bogus noise complaint, that wouldn't warrant this level of urgency. No, she'd gone bigger. And I was right when one of the deputies approached me. His first words were, "Sir, we received a report of a possible armed individual on the property and a disturbance involving threats toward a member of the community." I felt the heat rise in my chest, not from fear, but from the sheer audacity of it. This wasn't just petty harassment anymore. This was crossing into dangerous territory, the kind that could get someone hurt. Keeping my voice calm, I said, "Deputy, there's no one here but me. And the only thing I've been threatening is this stack of legal paperwork." He studied me for a moment, probably gauging whether I was about to become a problem, then signaled for his partner to check around the property. Karen, meanwhile, was in full performance mode, pacing back and forth like she was too rattled to stand still, telling anyone who would listen that she had barely escaped a confrontation and that I had been brandishing a weapon while shouting about keeping people off my land. Her tone was breathless, her words rapid-fire, designed to paint me as a dangerous recluse who was one bad day away from snapping. The deputy returned after a thorough search of the property dock, shed cabin, even the woods around the back. He shook his head. Nothing. No weapons, no signs of any disturbance. I could see the doubt beginning to form in their eyes, the realization that this might not be what they'd been told. I gestured toward the security camera above my porch and said, "If you'd like, I can show you the last 3 hours of footage right now. You'll see exactly what's been going on here, and more importantly, who's been coming and going." Karen's head snapped toward me at that, and for the first time, her confidence wavered. "That's unnecessary," she said quickly, her voice just a shade too high. But the deputies took me up on the offer, stepping inside as I pulled up the footage. There I was, sitting on the porch with my coffee, flipping through papers. And there was Karen, pulling into my driveway 5 minutes before the sheriff's cars arrived, walking around the edge of my property and then making a call from her cell phone. The timestamps told the story better than I ever could. When the deputies stepped back outside, their tone toward Karen had shifted. "Ma'am," one of them said, "we're not seeing any evidence to support your report. In fact, the footage shows you arriving here before we were dispatched." Karen's face tightened, her jaw clenching as she tried to salvage the moment. "Well, maybe he hid it before you got here," she said, but it was weak, almost desperate. The deputies exchanged a glance, one of them jotting something down in a small notebook. "We're going to file this as an unfounded call," the deputy continued. "But be advised, making false reports is a criminal offense. I'd hate to see anyone get into legal trouble over a misunderstanding." The emphasis on that last word wasn't lost on either of us. Karen mumbled something about being concerned for the community's safety, but her voice had lost that commanding edge. She got back into her SUV without another word to me and drove off at a speed just shy of reckless. The deputies offered me a quick nod, one of them quietly saying, "I'd keep that footage backed up. Might not be the last time." I assured them it was saved in 3 different places, thanked them for their time, and watched as they pulled away. The silence that followed was different from the one before. It wasn't heavy with tension. It was charged with resolve. Karen had just overplayed her hand in a big way, and she knew it. More importantly, so did I. If she'd been willing to go as far as making a false emergency call to try to intimidate me, it meant she was running out of subtle options. That desperation could be dangerous, but it also meant she was leaving. A trail of mistakes. That night I sat on the porch again, coffee replaced with a glass of bourbon, watching the moonlight ripple across the lake. I thought about how this whole feud had started with a demand for her weekend in my cabin, and how it had snowballed into a dangerous game of lies and power plays. I knew now that this wasn't just about me, it was about setting a precedent. If Karen could bulldoze over my rights with fabricated emergencies and manufactured violations, she could do it to anyone in the community. And maybe that was the part she hadn't counted on. The more she pushed, the more determined I became, not just to protect my own ground, but to make sure she couldn't pull the same tricks on anyone else. The next step wasn't just to defend it, was to go on the offensive. And I had the evidence, the witnesses, and the patience to do it. Building the case, the days following Karen's false emergency call felt different, like the air in the community had shifted ever so slightly. It wasn't something you could see outright, but there was a new undercurrent people glancing at me a bit longer when I passed by in town, some offering a quick nod or polite hello, others lowering their voices when I came into earshot. News travels fast in neighborhoods like ours, even faster when the source of the drama is someone like Corrine. She was the kind of person who thrived on being the first to tell a story. But after the sheriff's visit, it seemed her narrative wasn't holding up as neatly as she'd hoped. And when Karen's version of events started to crumble, so did her ability to keep the whispers in her favor. I decided it was time to stop reacting and start acting. If Karen wanted to play this as a long game, I'd simply play it better. My first step was reaching out to neighbors, not in a public way, but quietly, over coffee, or while lending a hand with small projects. I began to ask gentle questions about their experiences with the HOA, particularly with Karen at the helm. At first, most were hesitant. That's the thing about people who've been burned. They're cautious about speaking up, worried their words will find their way back to the wrong ears. But as soon as I shared what had been happening to me, the dam started to crack. One neighbor, an older man named Frank who'd lived here for over 20 years, told me about the time Karen tried to fine him $500 for having a non-compliant mailbox, even though it was the same model approved in the HOA's own handbook. Another, a young couple new to the area, confided that Karen had shown up at their door unannounced to inspect their backyard after hearing from another neighbor that they'd installed a small fountain. The fountain, of course, was perfectly within HOA guidelines, but the couple had been intimidated into removing it anyway. The stories kept coming. There was the retired schoolteacher whose flower beds Karen declared unsightly despite them winning a local gardening award. The single mom who had been fined repeatedly for parking violations when her car was in her own driveway. Each tale was its own small injustice, and taken alone, they might have seemed like the usual HOA nitpicking. But together, they painted a picture of systematic harassment, control, and overreach. And more importantly, they showed a pattern I could prove. I started documenting everything, not just my own experiences, but the stories of others. Dates, copies of notices, photographs, even audio recordings where people were willing to speak on record. I bought a large binder, the kind you could fit a semester's worth of college notes in, and began filling it section by section. My Karen files were no longer just about me, they were becoming a community archive of every questionable action she'd taken. Of course, I couldn't just walk into the next HOA meeting. Slap the binder on the table and expect justice. The board was still stacked with Karen loyalists, people who either didn't see the harm in her methods or simply didn't want to end up on her bad side. I needed leverage, and leverage came in the form of exposure, getting the right eyes on the right information. That's when I thought about the county's property ombudsman, a little-known office designed to mediate disputes between HOAs and homeowners. Most people didn't even realize it existed, which was exactly why Karen had been able to operate unchecked for so long. I made an appointment, driving into town with my binder-riding shotgun like a silent co-pilot. The ombudsman, a no-nonsense woman named Evelyn, listened intently as I laid everything out. She didn't interrupt much, but when she did, it was always to ask for specifics, dates, names, copies. When I finally closed the binder, she tapped the cover thoughtfully and said, "You have enough here to warrant a formal investigation. If what you've told me checks out, she's in violation of multiple state HOA statutes, not to mention possible misuse of community funds if any of these fines were collected improperly." That last part caught my attention, misuse of funds. If Karen had been padding the HOA's coffers with bogus fines, there was a paper trail, and money trails were the kind of thing that got even the most complacent board members to start asking questions. Evelyn promised to begin the process, but she warned me it wouldn't be instant. "These things take time," she said. "But time can be your ally if you keep collecting evidence and stay patient." Patience I had. And now I also had a strategy. In the weeks that followed, I kept my head down, at least outwardly. I didn't react to the occasional glares Karen shot my way when we crossed paths. I didn't respond to the 2 more violation notices that appeared in my mailbox. Instead, I kept documenting, kept listening, kept quietly encouraging others to stand their ground. The more people realized they weren't alone, the braver they became about speaking out. One evening, while I was locking up the shed, Frank stopped by with something in his hand, a folded envelope. Inside was a copy of an internal HOA email chain that had been slipped to him by a sympathetic board member. In it, Karen was openly discussing ways to push certain homeowners into selling, including me. She even listed tactics fines, public embarrassment, and strategic code enforcement. It was the smoking gun I hadn't dared hope for. Proof that her actions weren't just overzealous rule enforcement, but deliberate targeting. Holding that printout under the dim porch light, I felt something I hadn't felt since this whole ordeal began, the tide turning. For months, Karen had been the one dictating the pace of the fight, the one forcing me to respond. But now, I had her in her own words. The game had changed, and I intended to make sure the next move was mine. The fall of the Queen Bee, the morning of the next HOA meeting. The air had that strange mix of stillness and tension you get before a thunderstorm. I'd been to enough of these gatherings to know that most homeowners showed up out of obligation, rather than enthusiasm, sitting through the dull reports and petty bickering until they could quietly slip out. But that night was different. Word had been quietly circulating. Whispers about new information and big developments had made their way through the grapevine. Even the residents who usually avoided HOA politics like the plague seemed to be filing in, some clutching coffee, others just curious to see what the buzz was about. Karen, of course, presided over the proceedings like a queen addressing her court. She wore her signature expression, a mix of condescension and fake pleasantness, and her voice carried that falsely sweet tone she reserved for public speaking. But there was an edge to her tonight, a stiffness in her posture, as if she sensed that the room wasn't quite as firmly in her grasp as usual. The usual board members flanked her on either side, some trying to smile, others clearly uncomfortable. When it came time for community concerns, I stood up slowly, the thick binder in my hands. The weight of it wasn't just physical, it carried months of frustration, meticulous record-keeping, and the voices of people who'd been silenced or ignored. Karen's eyes narrowed just slightly when she saw me approach the microphone, and I could almost hear the gears turning in her head. She was expecting a complaint she could swat away with procedural jargon, maybe even a thinly veiled personal attack she could dismiss as disruptive behavior. What she wasn't expecting was what I had prepared. I started calmly laying out the first few documented incidents, keeping my tone measured and professional. I read the dates, the violation notices, the photographs. Then I moved to the testimonies from neighbors, people sitting in that very room, who had endured harassment and intimidation under her so-called enforcement of the rules. I didn't embellish or dramatize. The facts spoke loudly enough. Each time I finished a story, I flipped a page, the sound of the paper turning echoing in the silent room. Karen interrupted twice, both times trying to cut me off under the guise of keeping the meeting on track. Both times, I politely reminded her that the bylaws allowed any homeowner 5 minutes to address the board, and I had timed my remarks accordingly. The truth was, I'd planned it so each section flowed into the next seamlessly, and the more I spoke, the more the atmosphere shifted. People who'd come in indifferent were now leaning forward in their seats. A few were nodding. One woman even whispered, "That happened to me too," under her breath. And then, I brought out the trump card, the internal HOA email chain Frank had given me. I read Karen's own words aloud, the talk of pushing certain residents out, the strategic code enforcement, the deliberate targeting. A ripple went through the crowd, sharp and unmistakable. Karen tried to object, claiming the email was taken out of context and illegally obtained, but it was too late. The damage was done. Everyone had heard it. I finished by revealing that I had already submitted the entire binder, including that email, to the county's property ombudsman, who had opened a formal investigation. I explained that under state law, the board could be held financially liable for wrongful fines and harassment. I let that hang in the air for a moment, then added, "If anyone here has experienced something similar, now would be the time to come forward." The floodgates opened. One by one, homeowners began speaking up, sharing their own run-ins with Karen's brand of control. Some were hesitant, their voices shaky, but others spoke with the kind of conviction that comes from years of pent-up frustration. Each story chipped away at her authority. The board members, her so-called allies, were now exchanging uneasy glances, realizing their own positions might be at risk if they kept defending her. By the time the meeting adjourned, a motion had been raised to hold a special election for HOA president. Karen tried to push it to next quarter's agenda, but the crowd wasn't having it. The motion passed with a majority vote then and there. For the first time in years, the community had flexed its collective muscle, and it was clear Karen's reign was crumbling. Within 3 weeks, she was out. The investigation by the ombudsman confirmed multiple violations, including wrongful fines, abuse of authority, and questionable financial practices. She was ordered to repay thousands of dollars in improperly collected penalties, and the board was restructured with fresh faces, people who actually wanted to serve the community rather than control it. As for me, I didn't run for a board position. I didn't need to. My goal had never been power, it had been to reclaim peace, not just for myself but for everyone who had been living under her thumb. And when I walked down to the lake one quiet evening, the water catching the golden light of the setting sun, I realized that I'd done exactly that. The place I'd chosen as my home finally felt like it again, not because the HOA was gone, but because the community had found its voice. Karen, last I heard, she'd moved 2 towns over. Some say she's already joined another HOA board. I almost feel sorry for them, almost.